Hey everybody, my name is Baz and I'm a product manager here at GitHub. With me today is my colleague Kevin Backhouse, who is one of the security researchers in the GitHub Security Lab. And together we'd like to tell you about some of the work we've been doing in collaboration with our partners in the Open Source Security Foundation. Normally I start my conference talks by saying, please interrupt me. But by now you probably know that these talks are pre-recorded, so it's probably best if you don't try and interrupt. You'll end up shouting at your screen and it's going to be awkward. But please do send us your questions and remarks on Twitter. Our handles are on this title slide, together with the appropriate hashtag. And of course there's the live Q&A session afterwards. Let's dive in. We all know that testing security tools is hard. That's true for static analysis tools, for dynamic analysis, for web scanning, for fuzzing. And about a year ago, we asked ourselves the question, is it possible to use historical CVEs to benchmark security tools? It turns out you can. And in this talk, we'll explain how we did it. But let's start at the beginning and let's look at how most of us benchmark security tools right now. Now, Kev is a full-time security researcher, and he's got a lot of experience in this area. So, Kev, take it away.
Thanks, Baz. Traditionally, the way to judge the quality of a tool for finding vulnerabilities is to run it on a synthetic test suite. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of synthetic test suites to give you a bit more context on what their limitations are. So my own main experience with working on a synthetic test suite is with the Juliet test suite for C and C++. Juliet is part of NIST's SAMate project, and NIST is part of the US Department of Homeland Security. The purpose of the SAMate project is to improve software assurance by developing methods to enable software tool evaluations. So naturally, as a government-endorsed test suite, SAMate carries a lot of weight. And if you're a security tool vendor, then there's a high probability that your potential customers are going to want to know how good your SAMate test score is. So back in 2016, Bas and I were both working for Semel. That was before Semel was acquired by GitHub. And at that time, we were really starting to focus on the security market. And so it became quite important for us to make sure that we had a good SAMate test score. I was a member of the C and C++ analysis team at the time. And so I helped to work on the Juliet test suite to make sure that we were getting a good score on it. This is an example of one of the tests that I worked on. This is a test that is intended to determine whether your tool is able to detect integer overflows. So what this test does is it uses fscanf to read a number from standard in. And then down here, there's a multiplication where they're squaring the number. And that squaring operation might have an integer overflow. So you pass this test if you tag line 38 as being a potential vulnerability. Now here's another example. Again, it's testing whether you can detect integer overflow. And you can see it's very similar to the previous test. The difference here is that it's using fgets to read from standard in rather than fscanf. The data flow is a little bit different, and they're doubling the number rather than squaring it on line 45. So I wrote a query that was able to detect this pattern. And in fact, that query was really good bang for the buck, because what they've done is they've actually written a script that generates thousands of these tests. So they've got a few different ways of reading from standard in, a few different forms of data flow, and a few different operations that might have an integer overflow in them, and they've generated the cross product of those. And so with a single query, I was able to improve our test score by a few thousand. The problem with this test is it's not a very realistic vulnerability, because if you look on line 46, all that's happening with that number that might overflow is it's getting printed out. And so nothing bad really happens. And so if you show this result to a developer, they're probably not going to be very interested, because this is not a real vulnerability. And so, in fact, that query that I wrote, we've rated it a low precision query, and we don't display those query results to developers by default, because in practice, it's just too noisy on real code. Things that might overflow are very common in C code, and most of the time they're not a problem. And so if you just display all of them, then it's just noise from the developer's point of view, and it's not useful to them. So let's move on to the second example of a test suite. And this is something called OWASP Juice Shop. And this is actually a really well-made piece of code. Its tagline is the most modern and sophisticated insecure web application. And so what they've done is they've made a very detailed model of an e-commerce website with vulnerabilities deliberately inserted. Now, something important to point out here is that Juice Shop is not primarily intended as a test suite. It's intended as a teaching tool. The idea is that people can study how it works and learn about the different kinds of vulnerabilities that you need to watch out for if you're going to develop an e-commerce application of your own. Let me just show you Juice Shop. So you can see here it's like an e-commerce website that sells different types of juice. Let me show you an example of the kinds of vulnerabilities that they've inserted. So if I go to the login box here, there's an SQL injection attack. And so what's happened now is that I've used that SQL injection to be able to log in as the admin user on the website. And you can see that the application has detected that I've done that and is congratulating me for having solved one of the challenges in Juice Shop. Let me show you the code where that SQL injection vulnerability is. That's here. So you can see here that they're building an SQL query, and that's where the SQL injection vulnerability is. So even though Juice Shop is not specifically designed as a test suite, it's certainly useful for detecting whether or not your security tool can find these kinds of vulnerabilities. So you can run your tool on the code and see if it can find this line of code. The problem is that even something that's as well designed as Juice Shop is still skewed. If you see some dodgy code in Juice Shop, then there's high chance that it's a planted vulnerability. So it's a different situation than if you were looking at a genuine e-commerce application. If you saw dodgy code in a genuine e-commerce application, it might be a vulnerability, but it might not. I mean, there's a good chance that the developer does in fact know what they're doing. And if you look a bit closer, for example, you look up the call stack, you may well find that they've got some sanitization code in there to make sure that there isn't an SQL injection possibility in the code that you're looking at. So my opinion is that synthetic test suites create false incentives. The problem with all of them, even something as high quality as Juice Shop, is that they encourage tools to tag everything that looks a bit dodgy. And the problem that creates is that when you then run that tool on real code, they tend to produce a lot of false positives. And developers really don't like false positives. If your vulnerability scanning tool is too noisy, then they're just going to start ignoring it, which defeats the point of having the tool in the first place. So I'm going to hand back to Bas now, and he's going to talk about what we've done to try and improve this situation. Thanks.
Thanks, Kev. That was absolutely great. So, as Kev pointed out with his example, benchmark code bases contain synthetic vulnerabilities that are very different from real vulnerabilities, and as a result, the security tools produce lots of false positives and false negatives due to the way these vulnerabilities are planted. One other problem that we actually see with synthetic benchmarks is that those code bases have very few dependencies. They don't really test for the complex interplay between the source code itself and dependencies like web frameworks or database frameworks, SQL frameworks. And that's interesting because lots of vulnerabilities, lots of CVEs actually are caused by that complex interplay. So a security tool that works well on a synthetic benchmark might not do well at all in real life because it's missing those results. Last but not least, synthetic code bases rarely come with patches, and we need those patches in order to determine whether a security tool is able to recognize a fix. If it can't recognize a fix, that means it will flag up a false positive. It will continue to flag up a code base as vulnerable even after it has been patched. And if you work on a security team, or if you're a developer working with security tools, you know how frustrating it is when security tools flag up hundreds or even thousands of false positives. So, conclusion, synthetic vulnerabilities are not the same as real vulnerabilities. So why have we been using those synthetic vulnerabilities for all those years? Well, the simple answer is using real data used to be infeasible. And I'm not saying it's easy now, but it's become a little bit easier because we have more data. The first reason for having more data is there's simply more open source code and more vulnerabilities in open source code. In the early 2000s, a lot of CVEs were related to closed-sourced applications, and that means that these CVEs were not very useful for benchmarking tools with because the tools often need the source code. It's also a lot easier these days for small open source projects to request a CVE for their vulnerabilities. Previously, only large projects like Apache could do that, but smaller projects can do that too now. That means we have more CVEs to play with. And last but not least, there are now bounty programs. That means there are more people interested in hunting for vulnerabilities in open source code. Therefore, we have more vulnerabilities. Thank you very much to Google and HackerOne and companies like them who provide those bounty programs for open source code. So we have more data. We also have more compute power. And why is that interesting? Well, running a security tool takes time. And running it on one code base is sometimes already hard enough. Now imagine having to run it on hundreds of code bases because there are hundreds of CVEs to test against. Well, luckily that problem is embarrassingly parallel, which means that we can just run it in the cloud in parallel on large numbers of machines. Last but not least, we have more community power. The security community has grown massively in the last couple of years, and it's very hard for people to collaborate on a single vulnerable synthetic code base. But it's a lot easier for all of us to contribute metadata on different CVEs. So let's have a look at the data for CVEs. I mean, I could fill a whole Black Hat talk with just patterns in CVE data, but let's not do that. Let's have a look at the overall picture. Since 1999, we have assigned about 145,000 CVEs. And in the last 3 years, there's been on average 40 CVEs per day. But in 2020 so far, it's gone up to 53 CVEs per day. So we're in for a record this year. So we have lots of data to use for our CVE benchmark initiative. And here are the details. Our current benchmark contains over 200 JavaScript and TypeScript CVEs in open source projects. And it consists of sort of three components. For every single one of those CVEs, we have source code, both vulnerable and patched code. For each of those CVEs, we have metadata, most importantly, the fix commit and the exact code locations where we would expect a tool to flag up an alert or a vulnerability. And 3, we have tooling, or a CLI, to feed those CVEs to the security tools and then generate a report on how well these tools did. And the benchmark is really interested in two measurements, two aspects. One is, how good are these tools at actually detecting the vulnerability in the vulnerable code? That we call the sensitivity. So we want tools to have a low false negative rate. And secondly, we care about the number of patches the security tools recognized. Because if they don't recognize the patch, that results in a false positive. And we want a tool to have a low false positive rate. We call that the specificity. And here's the outline of the process. For every CVE and for every tool, we feed both the vulnerable and the patched code to the tool. And then we check, does this tool indeed flag up the CVE, or is this a false negative? And does it recognize the patch, or does it produce a false positive? And then we add the score for that CVE to the scorecard for the tool. And this all runs on your machine today. I'll give you a demo in a moment. And the CVE benchmarking tooling takes care of all of the plumbing, connects it all together. It clones the Git repository, runs the tools, it decides whether a tool recognized the CVE, and it generates a report. But I just glossed over, how do we actually know that a tool detected a CVE, and how do we know it recognized a patch? Well, first of all, we scan the vulnerable code base, as I just explained, and then we look at the metadata for the CVE in the benchmark dataset, because we've specified for each CVE which code locations we care about. Where do we expect a tool to flag up an alert? If a tool does not flag up an alert in any of these locations, we call that a false negative. The tool did not detect the CVE. If the tool did indeed flag up the CVE, then we look at very carefully which rule was responsible for generating that alert, because we need that in step number 2, where we check the patched code base. We know from step 1 which rule generated the interesting alert. On the patched code base, when we run the security tool again, we expect that particular rule to report fewer alerts. If it reports just the same number of alerts, that means that it is actually reporting a false positive. After all, the vulnerability has been fixed, so we should see fewer alerts. Let me show you how that works in practice, in action. So I'm going to start with a CLI very briefly. Here I am about to start the CLI on ESLint. That means I'm going to ask ESLint to analyze a bunch of CVEs, to analyze a bunch of code bases for CVEs. In fact, I've asked it to analyze code bases, analyze CVEs related to the MITRE CWE top 25. So we've determined which CVEs are of interest and are now running ESLint against that. And the output of the CVE benchmark tool is a bunch of JSON files. So you can just manually inspect those and manually sort of analyze those if you like. Let me stop there here because I've actually got those results ready already. Let's have a look at one of the ways in which the CVE benchmark framework outputs its results. One of them is on the CLI, nice and simple in an ASCII formatted table. So if you're working on a CLI and you want to have a quick look at what the results are, you can do that right there. But more importantly, there is also a web interface that presents all of the results for every CVE, for every tool organized by CWE. So you see the different tools that I've benchmarked for this particular occasion as columns. I've left the tool names off because I'm not actually interested in giving you advice on which tools are good and which tools are bad. I'm just interested in showing you the benchmark framework here. And what you see here is at the top a summary. In green, the green indicates that a tool has found, in this case, 16% of the CVEs. It has found both the vulnerability and it has recognized a patch. The orange bar indicates that for 48%, it did indeed recognize the vulnerability, but not the patch. And red, of course, tells you that it didn't recognize anything at all. And these are relative percentages relative to the CVEs that were detectable. So we're looking at CVEs that were detected by at least one of the tools in the benchmark exercise. And I can, of course, look at which tools actually recognized which CVEs. So, for example, I can drill down into CWE20 and click on this CVE over here. And I can see the source code. I can see that there's a vulnerability right over there. It's an incomplete sanitization that doesn't quite protect against all cross-site scripting attacks. I can see which of the tools have found a vulnerability or not, and which of the tools recognized the patch, I can drill down into the tools. For example, this tool over here, I know detected the CVE but did not recognize the patch. I can look at the benchmark dataset, sort of that powers this all. Here we see the data for one particular CVE. So there's many of these sort of specifications in the dataset, and it describes exactly where we would expect an alert to be found, with a few external references to information you might be interested in. So that's just scratching the surface of what this tool can do. There's many more different ways of looking at this data. And I do indeed encourage you to give this a spin, because it's open source. You can use it straight away today. One of the reasons why we open source this is, you're probably not surprised, because we need your help to make it even better. To make it even better by improving the dataset, for example, by adding new CVEs. At the moment, we're looking for TypeScript and JavaScript CVEs in open source code, with other languages coming soon. Or you can have a look at our existing data and see whether it needs improving. Alternatively, you could add support for your own security tools. If you are benchmarking a particular tool at the moment, if you're interested in evaluating a particular tool that we don't support yet, please do add it. To create a driver for such a tool is a very simple process. There's plenty of documentation, plenty of examples as well, of course, and typically takes only 200 lines of code, so it's really not that complicated. And like I said, it's open source, and here you have in one slide all of the GitHub repositories that you need to take this out for a spin. The metadata and tooling, all of the vulnerable and patched code bases, and we have a few ideas of what we want to do next. We want to regularly update and publish the results of all of the tools that we currently support. We would love to also make it easier for people to run the benchmark against or on cloud infrastructure. Of course, we would like to support other languages, and we're working very hard on that, and suggestions are very welcome. And in general, your suggestions are more than welcome. So please ping me on Twitter, or ask a question, make a suggestion during the live Q&A in a moment. Last but not least, thank you very much for being here today at Black Hat Europe on screen, virtually. And I would also like to thank all of the people who helped us with this. It wouldn't have been possible without the contributions from all of our partners in the OpenSSF security tooling working group. In particular, Simon, Nico, Dave, Kostya, Abhishek, and Marcel, thank you so much for your contributions. And I would also like to thank our colleagues at GitHub, in particular Esben and Eric, who did most of the work on the engineering side of this, but also Arthur, Rasmus, Chris, and many, many others. So I really hope that you'll take a look at the CVE benchmark framework. Give it a go. Let us know what you think. Open a pull request, open an issue, ping me on Twitter, ask in the Q&A. You know where to find us. Thank you very much, and have a great day.